Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Alumni Reunion. My name is Charmaine Williams, and I'm the Interim Dean at the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work. We are so happy to welcome you today for our annual Stress-Free Degree Lecture Series. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and learn on this land. Whenever I do a land acknowledgement, I like to take a moment to think about how it applies to what's going to happen next. And as we sit here to talk about a housing crisis, I'm struck by the fact that I think the people who have stewarded this land for so long probably had a way of thinking about how you took care of the land and took care of each other to make sure that everybody had shelter and everybody was safe. And today, unfortunately, I don't think that's the story we're going to hear from Dr. Hulchanski. Stress-free degrees give you the chance to attend a class with some of our renowned professors on timely issues. And the best part is, we're not going to give you any homework. If you're joining us from home, we encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A feature located in the right hand of your screen. And now we will begin our stress-free degree featuring Professor David Hulchanski and his talk, The GTA Housing Crisis, Can It Be Solved? Let me give you a little bit of a bio on Dr. Hulchanski. David Hulchanski is a professor of housing and community development at the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work, where he holds the Dr. Chow Ye Ching Chair in Housing. A renowned expert on housing and community development, he is the principal investigator of the decade-long national study, Neighborhood Change Research Partnership, and the author of the 3 Cities Within Toronto report. Professor Hulchanski is the former director of U of T Center for Urban and Community Studies and former editor of the North American journal, Housing Studies. Professor Hulchanski also taught me in a course called Housing and Homelessness when I was doing my MSW, and it changed how I saw everything afterwards. I hope the same thing is going to happen for you. Please welcome Professor David Hulchanski.
Well, thank you, Dean Williams. Here we are, 2022, and we're talking about the housing crisis. Does that make sense? One of the wealthiest countries on earth. The photo you see here is one I took in 2008, and that sign is still up on the Windmill Line Co-op in the St. Lawrence neighborhood. Anybody driving the Gardiner from the east heading towards Jarvis will see that sign there, Housing for All. I mention this because you may or may not know that the St. Lawrence neighborhood has 3,500 housing units that were built in the late 70s and the early 80s when we did have a social housing supply program, and half of all those 3,500 units are nonprofits and co-ops, and to this day they house a mix of income people on the lower income side, quite a diverse population. So the question we have here is, can the housing crisis be solved? So there is what I call a cynical answer that housing is just so complex and involves so many things, and it is the largest budget item for most households, except they're very wealthy, that there will always be some crisis. And here you see the first of a series of Toronto Star newspaper articles from 1970. Sorry, I'm getting things mixed up. 1967, yes, from 1967. And you see the title there of the series, Crisis on the home front. And so from January to June, the Toronto Star ran a series about that. So something that caught my eye was the fact that they pointed out that in 1967, house prices for better houses jumped from about $20,000 to $25,000. Rents jumped from $175 a month to $200. And then the majority of people earned less than $8,000 in Toronto at the time. So when you use the Bank of Canada inflation calculator, you inflation adjust those figures, what do you see? Well, the rents, $1,675 inflation adjusted. It happens at a one-bedroom apartment today in Toronto. If you're looking for one, they rent for about $2,000 or so in that ballpark. And then the average of all such apartments are about $1,700 or $1,800, actually. And then the income, it's not clear if they're talking about household income, individual income, but that is close to a median income today. The one figure that is really off, right, is the cost of houses. So where do we find the $210,000 house for sale in Toronto? Really, how many hundreds of miles, if not more than hundreds of miles, do we have to go to find a good quality house at $210,000? So what's going on there? So if we had the time, we could discuss this. Why the difference between the rents and the house prices? So to begin to answer the question we have before us, why is there still this crisis? It's buried in there someplace, isn't it? So if you knew a little bit about housing policy over the past 4 or 5 decades, you will know that starting in the 1970s, we began regulating rents. Rents have been regulated in Ontario since the 1970s. And so there's an allowable cost pass-through for renovations, but there's a set amount of increase per year. On the home ownership side, what? There are no regulations. And so this is part of my theme in this short talk, is that we have policy choices, policy options, and we've made some on the rental sector, and we've allowed, though, the private sector, the home ownership side to be the full wild market. So when researchers look at this, housing is not a complex thing. There's the cliche about rocket science. That's complicated, but it's not complicated for rocket scientists. It's for the rest of us, right? So our job as researchers is to try to sort things out, to try to understand the exercise, in this case, of financial and political power over our housing system, which I and others who write about this refer to it as a dysfunctional housing system. Remember, by housing system, think about the term healthcare system. We use that term for our healthcare system because the biggest part of it is not market, right? The insurance side is not market, so it's not the healthcare market, it's the healthcare system. Here, though, we do leave things to the market, as that history of housing policy book title says, keeping to the marketplace. So we need to make better housing policy choices. In what areas? Going back to, in fact, my predecessor, in the late 1940s, after World War II, Humphrey Carver was an instructor here at the University of Toronto in the School of Social Work. And I have all my students, including Charmaine, Dean Williams, in the first session of all my housing courses, read chapter 6 of it. Because there's 2 points there. One point that Humphrey Carver makes is the last two sentences in that chapter. You see there, basically, we have a choice. Do we have a philosophy that says everyone should be adequately housed at a reasonable price, or not? So if we say not, why worry about it? We don't have a housing problem, we don't have a housing crisis. So I think there's lots of people out there who say we really don't have a housing crisis. Now, the other thing that chapter does is to say that the ultimate housing problem is supplying affordable housing to low-income renters. So how do low-income renters find a place in the marketplace, rental marketplace? And they have great difficulty back then, and they have great difficulty since. And one solution to that is a supply of social housing, nonprofits and co-ops, and or using housing benefit or housing allowances, which we weren't doing at that time. So what does our housing system look like? It's those three numbers you see there. We're 69% ownership, 27% private rental, and then 4% non-market rental. So when you look at the home ownership side, there's an assumption by some people that wealthy nations are nations of homeowners. But you see there Germany and a number of other countries that are under or near 50% home ownership. What I'm pointing out here is just how different similar nations, Western nations, housing systems can be. On the social housing side, the non-market housing side, you see where Canada stands at the 4%, but in the Netherlands, 1/3 of all households live in nonprofit housing. So there's no one right percentage there. I certainly argue that 4% is way too little. That 4% comes from 3 decades. The 1960s to the 1990s, we were building about 20,000 social housing units per year, and then we stopped doing it in the mid-1990s, a period where there were budget cutbacks and so on. In Toronto alone, we were opening about 4,000 social housing units per year for those 30 years. And then we stopped doing that. We're down to a couple hundred per year. The housing allowance chart, you see Canada isn't on there, because 2 years ago, we finally began a small housing benefit. These are payments to lower income households to help them pay the rent, is what it is. So some countries put money into that to help people out, and some countries put less. And that's a percent of the GDP. Again, housing systems are all very different. But my point here, and one of my main points, is simply, if we want a good housing system, an inclusive housing system, it needs to do 3 things. If you think about it, let's have enough supply. But that's not good enough. The supply should be a mix of housing, a choice in housing by size, types, owning, renting, locations, and all that, special needs. And third, we should assist those who cannot afford or access appropriate housing. And here I talk about afford, which you understand, but access, I'm referring to discrimination. People don't have equal access to our rental or even our home ownership housing, as I'll point out shortly. So I feel we're doing number 1 fine, but number 2 and number 3 we're not doing very well, and that really is part of the crux of the problem. Here 2 years ago is The Economist, you might know as a conservative type economic magazine. It's been around since the 1850s. Are they against home ownership? The horrible housing blunder, right? Western nations' obsession with home ownership, which is undermining growth and fairness in the housing system. And when you look at that chart, the top line is residential assets, the value of residential assets compared to the other kinds of assets there, to the stock market, commercial property, and so on. So in the Western world, we have put a lot of our resources into housing. And the argument here is there's nothing wrong with home ownership, but it also needs to be regulated and controlled. The implications of high home ownership are well known in the housing literature, because you end up with a country with a majority of homeowners as voters. Nothing wrong with that, but it's a fact. So then that majority helps set policy and can be appealed to by different lobby groups in case government wants to change something in the housing system. And you see there the IMF and other organizations have been noting what's going on in Canada with some alarm, but that's largely ignored. So right now, instead of having affordable housing for all, look at the way our ownership sector works. I'm a homeowner and happy to be one. So again, I'm not knocking home ownership, but it is expected to be a great investment and that the government would keep it that way. It's expected to be a form of retirement savings. It is tax-free capital gain since 1971, and it's an intergenerational wealth transfer. So that's good for people who are homeowners, and particularly in hot housing markets in other parts of the country. The inflation-adjusted value of the houses don't quite keep up that well. So there's a choice to be made, and I found it interesting as I was preparing for this on the weekend, the Toronto Star business columnist there raising a similar issue, profiting from the housing market and wanting the housing to be affordable is in contradiction, right? So it's not an either or, it's the balance. And the point of that a good column there is that we are out of balance on that score. And then you see another headline, Canada has the biggest gap between incomes and house prices. So that is another part of the problem, incomes. And here's just one of many charts one could see, and this is an index of the relationship between incomes and house prices, what has happened in Canada, the red line, and then the G7 countries and OECD, other lines. So there is something quite unusual going on here in Canada on that ownership side. Now, part of the big picture is we hear from our governments often, well, we don't have enough money. We're running a deficit. We don't have enough money and all that. We used to have enough money before the 1990s when we started cutting taxes. When you cut taxes, it doesn't benefit people who don't pay much in taxes already, lower income people, middle income people. So it's a type of income redistribution. And you see we are among the low tax countries, which happen to be Anglo-American countries in general. And you see from the chart on the right, our history of sort of inching towards Europe, but then in the 1990s, see 1% of the GDP collected as taxes, many, many billions of dollars. So we could have or should have some of that money, and we don't, to address housing needs. Now, remember the relationship between income and housing. Well, if income inequality increases, which it has, the chart on the right is the 1%. You can see around 1990, they move up with a bigger share of the national income annually. And then I show you Toronto, the top 5% and the bottom 50%, what has happened to incomes there. So what does this mean for housing? Well, when we had a big middle income group, the housing market served the big middle income group. Once we shrank the middle income group, the high-end, high-income end of the spectrum is more numerous and big, but the low end is much bigger. And low-income people or poor people don't drive the housing market, do they? It's people with money to drive a market. And so we have people with a lot of money driving our housing market. I want to say a few words then too, something that I feel Torontonians are very uncomfortable talking about, is that the income and wealth inequality and the nature of the housing difficulties are highly racialized. And access to opportunity is not equal. There's a saying, work hard and you'll prosper, and you'll be successful. Well, it really is work hard and have fair access to opportunities, and you will be successful, other things being equal. And here's a study we did with the United Way of Toronto, and you can see the center dot point on the bottom there refers to the City of Toronto, that for every dollar a white person earns, a racialized person earns 52 cents. Remember, the City of Toronto is about 50% racialized, meaning non-white, and about 50% white. The gap in income in the City of Toronto is huge. That's why it's 52%, and in the suburbs, the difference is a little bit less because they have fewer really, really high-income people in Peel and New York compared to the City of Toronto. That's the difference there. And something I'd like to show is where rental housing is, and in this case, where do Toronto's Black renter households live? So 2 concentration maps. The concentration of rental housing is in the old City of Toronto. And where do Black Torontonians live? Well, you see it on the map there. How does that happen? This is an outcome measure of discrimination. So decade by decade, people were pushed elsewhere. What about homeowners? Whoops. Home ownership, same thing. We're 50% renters in the city, 50% homeowners. Map on the left are concentrations of census tracts with concentrations of ownership, and on the right, where you find concentrations of Black homeowners and where you don't find them. So we're highly segregated that way. There's something called the dissimilarity index that measures segregation in cities. If you look at a list of the 50 most segregated cities, metropolitan areas in the United States, and then if Toronto was on that list, if it was a list of North American metropolitan areas, where would Toronto rank? I think a lot of people say, well, it doesn't rank among the top 50, right? No, it would be number 40. It would be right next to Minneapolis, St. Paul, the former home, before he died, of George Floyd. And we know a lot about Minneapolis, St. Paul. And that isn't Toronto, but the level of segregation is about the same in the 2 cities. So, as mentioned, I'm part of a team that produced what's called the 3 Cities in Toronto. That's basically over a timeline from the 1970s, how more and more of the city's census tracts, there are about 500 census tracts now, are low income and going lower in socioeconomic status. And then the high income census tracts are more numerous and much, much higher income. And then the middle income census tracts, what some people call the middle class, there's fewer and fewer of the middle income census tracts. So this is a geographical way of showing the changes in income distribution. That study was updated with the United Way a few years back, and we hope to do it again in another year or 2. But you see those 4 policy areas. What explains the growth in inequality that I'm showing you are year-by-year changes in these 4 policy areas. Think about the labor market before the 1990s. all the factory, industrial jobs. These days, the gig economy, part-time jobs, jobs on benefits and all that. Housing, we're talking about in detail. Discrimination. One kind of discrimination links to other kinds. So if you discriminate against in employment, you're going to have less money for housing, and it overlaps there. And then finally, year by year from the 1990s especially, we cut income support programs for lower income people, but then also cut taxes for everyone, except they really benefit higher income people. So this is sort of good news in that we did those things year by year, frankly, for about 3 decades now. We could do those things year by year, small steps year by year, and turn things around. And I'm coming to the end here about policy choices. So back in 1967, the housing crisis was of a certain character, but the housing crisis today is of a very different character, and it involves things on that list. And very few of those things were either existed or were very serious back in that example of 1967. See, multiple property ownership. Statistics Canada has come out with a couple studies recently. There's quite an astounding number of people. In the Toronto metropolitan area, just in our metropolitan area here, 360,000 homeowners own more than one house. And 75% of them own at least 2 additional ones. And then a small minority of that group play the whole market. They own a lot and they're flipping all the time, the speculation in the house flipping. So there's nothing wrong with owning another property and renting it out, fine. Some of that has always gone on, but is really very big now. And it's anyone with money. And remember the income and wealth inequality that we have so many households that don't know what to do with the money, and some of it should go into real estate. And then all of these multiple property owners, the 360,000 in Toronto, they basically own houses in Toronto, because they're not big corporations. They have to know the geography and so on. So there's an enormous amount of wealth and residential real estate wealth being accumulated by a small percentage of Torontonians. So the wealthiest 10% of Torontonians already own about 25% of all the housing wealth in Toronto. So this is not yet corporations, right? These are individuals who are really well off. And so this is part of the thing that leads to housing not being available for people who want to buy and live and settle down. Tied in with that are the number of housing units left vacant, and we now have numbers on that. Would you believe 92,000 vacant units in the most recent census? Now, some of them are vacant for other reasons. So this is an indicator, it's not the exact number. But this is an increase of 40% over 5 years ago of people buying condos or houses and leaving them vacant because they're easier to flip that way. And housing used as Airbnb, hotel rooms. We didn't have any of that in the distant past, but this is taking rental units away from people who want to rent and live in Toronto and using them as hotels. You know about gentrification, and then we get into the corporate pools of money nationally and globally, about buying up rental properties and big numbers of houses even, and we provide tax subsidies to that, real estate investment trusts. And then there's money laundering, of course, lots of illegal things, and in real estate, it's pretty easy to do that and get away with that. And the main reason is that in Canada, we maintain secrecy over who owns what. There doesn't have to be much disclosure. So it's called the beneficial ownership, knowing who is the beneficial owner, and in Canada, it's very difficult to do that. So things can be hid from the taxman. So you see, and I'm showing you some of the journal articles too, some of my colleagues. We've studied all these things, we know all about these things. And if you look at the things on the list there, either a regulation or a disincentive, a tax, or an incentive if it's something good, right? Or better policing, like in fact, disclosure of who owns what and all that. So we're not talking about any big money at fixing this part, but about addressing these issues. And a lot of things would be way calmer in the housing markets like Toronto and Vancouver and many others. The issue of vacant units, for example, in Vancouver, about 3 years ago, they introduced a tax, and it's 3% of the assessed value. And so in the census, there's 10% fewer vacant units in 2021, the census year, compared to 5 years earlier. Okay, so things like that do work if you're serious about them. And just by doing that, we calm the housing market. Nothing has to be taken away from homeowners necessarily, but there's something called tenure neutrality in housing research. Tenure refers to owners and renters. We are not tenure neutral in Canada. We of course favor home ownership with all kinds of tax breaks and subsidies and so on, and there's very little equivalent for the private rented sector. And then in the 1990s, we stopped building social housing. So we need to fix that, and that's why I referred to us being a low tax country. Nobody likes taxes, but if they're used well, we're a wealthy country and we have the money there to do that. So I hope this is helpful, stringing together a variety of things, because the answer is yes. The housing crisis of today can be addressed. Solved is a pretty strong word, but certainly addressed and made better. But we have a decision to make, right? Do you want our housing system to be what it is now, which is this mechanism for increasing wealth and income inequality, because that's what's going on in our housing market, or then to do those three things you see on the left there, as I mentioned earlier, make sure we have an adequate supply, but to make sure that that supply is a mix, providing choice for people who need that. And number three, of course, assisting people so they do have adequate and appropriate housing. And of course, that includes not having mass homelessness as a fact of life as part of the nature of our housing system. So this is my brief journey through the issue, the attempt to answer that. Can it be solved? What is the it? And indeed, go back decade by decade by decade for 80 years, you'll find literature, government reports, studies that use the term housing crisis. We have a housing crisis. Well, at each period, it's slightly different. And I ended up here with some of the key features that we know. We have all the research, we've documented, and yet we're not doing much about it. Interestingly, if you do follow the federal and provincial budget, and then the recent federal campaign and the current provincial campaign, some politicians are talking about some of these things, but they're not very serious. The attempts to curb speculation or whatever are modest or feeble and not very significant. And you also hear about foreign buyers of our houses, right? Well, it's a small issue compared to the multiple property ownership buyers, right? There's an Ontario tax that was begun 5 or 6 years ago, and a tax is a foreign buyer of a house. And you know how many people per month have to pay that tax? It's roughly 100. So about 1,200 per year, okay? And it's a modest tax, and the foreigners are not the issue. On the rental side, yes, pools of money, which is international, including Canadian. That is a big problem too in the real estate investment trusts and all those kinds of vehicles, where housing is turned into an asset class as opposed to a place to live. So finally, I'll close. Back in 1967, the houses we had were for local people to live in. Right? That's all that happened. And it was a local market. Local people bought the houses or rented the houses. Local builders built the houses, and local developers developed the rental buildings and all that of that era, right? And that's all very different today. So with our remaining time, I'll be happy to answer questions from the room and then from those who are observing online. Yes?
Canada is one of the largest land masses in the world, in terms of the countryside. I mean, because we're having this housing crisis. So we're having this massive housing crisis, but we are among the largest landowners, in terms of the mass of land we have in Canada. So it's a very strange situation.
We could talk in detail about urban land, the price of urban land, and the speculation in land, and the rezoning, and who captures the value from the rezoning. And the question you're raising is simply noting Canada's really, really big. I mean, that's a line from some kid's song, I remember. Canada is really, really big, yes. But most of Canada, that's big, is difficult to live in, to say the least, okay? So we live along that southern border. And so we are a relatively high density urban nation, simply because of climate and all that. Much like Australia. Australia has its great white north, but it's all desert and sand, right? We have snow and ice and all that. So yeah, the United States is a bit different because they can live any place in that country, unlike our big country. So thanks. Another question from the room? Yes.
On the first slide, you had 3 figures, and the housing prices were one of those adjusted for inflation. I mean, as far as I know, inflation is not the only factor that drives prices, right? So can we take into account the other factors like market? What happens then?
I'm not sure what you mean by other factors, because this is, the gap is so large, right? The $200,000 figure compared to the 1.5 million or something, right? Requires, so adjusting for the way the inflation adjustment works and all that, because it is housing, and I think that's the point you're making, there are some other factors that complicate that, but not enough to get anywhere near the gap, right? Does that seem reasonable, or just?
Expensive because there are fewer of them, demand and, that stuff.
You're talking about housing supply?
Yeah, I mean, if you have fewer houses and more people who are looking for accommodation for houses, then housing will be more expensive.
See, but on the supply side, we happen to have some of the highest supply ever in our history. And you hear complaints from some places that municipalities are not zoning enough and cooperating and quickly zoning land. But the reality is, Mississauga will tell you, City of Toronto planners will tell you, there's 20 or 30,000 zoning for 20 or 30,000 housing units in both these municipalities that are not being built on. So developers go after the rezoning, increases the property value and all that, and some intend to build, and some don't. Some then have an extra valuable asset that they're sitting on for another day or another sale or something, right? So that complicates the supply thing. So we are supplying a lot of housing, but it is the wrong mix. It's all these small condos, really, when we need family housing and so on. Now, we have questions online. Why did the housing market cool off so abruptly, and will it rise back to previous levels, or is this change going to be permanent? Yeah, so that's, I believe, talking about the here and now, that you read in the recent 2 months or so, there's a bit of a leveling out and a bit of a cooling off. I'm glad that question was asked, because I could talk about housing bubbles. Some of you might know from the past, there would be a housing bubble, and what that means is that house prices in a market just took off so high that so few people could afford them. At a certain point, there was a dramatic collapse, a burst of the bubble, and a very dramatic collapse. Well, that happened in the past because, as I said earlier, housing markets in the past were purely local, people wanting to live there. So Vancouver is an example. In 1981, there was a dramatic collapse because only a few % of people could buy houses that were on the market, and there were people who had to sell houses because they're moving or whatever, and so that's a housing bubble. There have been people predicting a housing bubble for 15 years now, and it hasn't happened, and it's for reasons I just said. The wealth and inequality, income inequality is so great, both locally and globally, that there are local and global people looking to park money, invest in certainly in a safe country. So I'm not in the prediction business, but okay, having studied this, it's an estimate that we'll see some flattening for a while. But the reason there won't be a collapse, who knows, I'll be wrong tomorrow, is there's just so much money in not only in Toronto, but in Canada and elsewhere looking to buy real estate. So if prices fall enough, there'll be enough people wanting to grab those units and maintaining the price, maybe not going up as it once did, but certainly not collapsing. So I don't see a housing bubble, and maybe tomorrow morning I'll be proven totally wrong. So second question from online is, how similar is Toronto to New York City? They're doing reasonably well, so isn't Toronto on that trajectory? I'm not sure what the reference is to New York City doing reasonably well. I happen to follow what's going on in New York City housing and all that fairly closely. They have their own versions of all this going on right now, but in a city that is much larger than Toronto. So I'm sorry, I don't understand that online question. I think we're on a similar trajectory, frankly, but it is different. The countries are different, the cities are different, the laws and all that are a bit different. But they have quite a severe problem with homelessness, worse than ours. Ours is very bad. 7,000 people will use shelter beds tonight in Toronto alone. Right? Did I see a hand here now? Yes.
Yes, first of all, thank you for the interesting discussion. When you mention a housing crisis, do we incorporate condos in that equation at all, or are we looking just at houses as the crisis?
Okay, so for clarification, yeah, when I talk about houses, I'm talking about home ownership, basically, or ownership housing. So some of those units, which would normally be ownership housing in the ownership sector, are bought as investment. They become rental if they're rented out. Yeah, so I'm referring to both.
So to continue on with this, last I heard, they're not making any more land, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. And I think most people want to find themselves in a position of having a house, not a condo. Condos you can just build as high and create as much density as possible, but most people still dream of home ownership. So how do the three levels of government possibly get into a situation of creating more homes in, let's say, the core of Toronto, where they are meaningful homes, without starting to invade on parkland and ravine space, et cetera?
So you're talking about detached and semi-detached houses in Toronto? Well, row housing, yeah, but there's no land any longer for those subdivisions. Remember, all the detached and semi-detached houses, neighborhoods with those houses, were once subdivisions. I live in the 1920 subdivision, okay, Bloor West Village. It was just land, and then somebody subdivided it and built those houses. In the 1960s, somebody else came along and tore down a whole lot of them near Hyde Park, right, and put up rental, because there was a subsidy program for rental, and now they're filling in more of that area, but with condos, because that's what makes money, and rental isn't making money. Now, one thing I didn't mention about rental and why it's not making money is that homeowners have double the income of renters. So we have one land market. We don't have a renter's land market and a homeowner's land market. It's one land market, and we have one cost formula for housing. But when a whole pool of people who need housing have half the income of another pool of people, well, that's creates a problem right there, and explains then why in the market, I don't blame the market, but they can't build rental housing and make money unless there's some government subsidy. Another question from the room? I say yes, straight ahead. Oh, I should watch the microphone, people, okay. If you want to ask a question next, yes, okay, you'll be next. So go ahead, please, yeah.
You've outlined the problem beautifully and suggested some solutions. I'm with an organization called ACORN. Have you heard about them?
Oh, yes, no, I'm familiar with ACORN, yes. A community organizing group of people on social issues and social justice issues. Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
So they take a lot of action, and like going to City Hall and so on. So they're just going with studies that they haven't done, but people like you have done. So with your voice, I'm just wondering, what can be done right now? Maybe through ACORN or other, like, going to City Hall, to the politicians, and demand, like, these are the problems. I can offer you these, suggest these solutions. So what can you, in your power, do, like right now? Can you force somebody, the powers that be?
Yeah.
Like,
see,
what can be done? All right.
See, in our imperfect democracy, and all democracies are imperfect, but the mayor and the people around the mayor, right, in the executive, the premier and the cabinet and the prime minister and the cabinet, they have great power. They can decide to do things. They decide to allocate money, and so each organization has to pick something depending on size and interest of the organization, and go after some kind of social change. Yeah. So we could talk later or some other day. There's a long list of things that the city should do and should do better and be serious about, or the province or the federal government. So, question over there? Yes?
I believe I have the microphone. A couple of points. First, it's a known fact that Toronto has more cranes in the sky than New York City. And further to the point of the other gentleman there, of course, they're not making any more land. And if you want to get an inner city house, they're not making more of those. As a previous home inspector, I'll tell you one of the problems is the realtors are greedy. So when you have a bidding war, one of the conditions is no inspection. They don't want you to know what's wrong. They just want to pocket the money and make more. Okay, now my actual question, are there any mechanisms in place to prevent, reduce, or reverse foreign ownership. Houses on both the east and west coast of Canada are being bought up by foreigners.
To reverse foreign ownership?
So reduce it, prevent it,
yes.
any kind of mechanism in place?
Absolutely. When I mentioned our foreign house buyers tax in Ontario is for show only, they're not serious about that because there's so many loopholes and all that. So you just have to be serious about that. Google Switzerland foreign house ownership, and you'll see quite quickly, foreigners cannot own housing in Switzerland, period. And if Swiss people who own houses flip, but sell their house within 5 years, there's a progressive year by year tax for what could be assumed to be flipping or speculation, okay? So every housing system can bring in certain regulations that are meaningful, and we're not doing that right now. And you raise real estate agents. Yes, we all, they're a professional that helps out, right? Intermediary in the market there. But I looked it up, monitor this a bit. You know how many real estate agents there are in Ontario? Huh? 82,000. These are members of the Ontario Real Estate Association. 82,000, that is one real estate agent for every 50 households, renters and owners. Now, some of them are not very busy, or some of them are doing commercial real estate and all that. But it's one of the few areas where we have also not a fee for service, but they take a percentage of the asset, right? So what professionals do that? There might be some others, but that's not normal, right? So we grew up with a system that is highly lucrative for a minority of those real estate agents. Not all of them do very well, given that there are so many of them. But we, in Ontario, our housing system is supporting 82,000 real estate agents, more numerous than lots of other professions. We have questions from online. Why did we stop building social housing? That was in 1995. How can we effectively lobby for social housing? Yes. You might know we have a national housing strategy since 2017. A $70 billion housing strategy, we're told all the time. That is mainly loans to the private sector builders of rental housing. So it is rental housing, but it's very expensive rental housing. So it was in 1993 that the federal government, when the Liberal Party was elected, agreed with the previous government, a conservative government, that they would stop funding new social housing units. So it was sort of mutual agreement of the two parties, even though the Liberals wasn't what the Liberals said they were going to do. So in 1995, in their budget, the Chrétien government, Paul Martin, finance minister, said that as of 1995, we, the federal government, no longer in housing, but we're no longer in affordable housing or social housing. We're still in subsidizing home ownership and doing all that stuff. But, and then we're going to download existing social housing. And they did that. So it was downloaded to the provinces, and the provinces, Ontario, and downloaded it to municipalities. So the Toronto Community Housing Corporation, which we who live in Toronto co-own as a public corporation, owns about 60,000 mainly aging social housing buildings. Rehab money was not downloaded with them, but the existing stream of subsidies was downloaded with them, but those are ending now, that stream of subsidies. So they're full of lower income people, and some of them are very old because they date from the 1950s and 1960s. So we stopped building social housing as part of restraint, cutbacks, deficit reduction. And Paul Martin, as finance minister, did get to zero deficits for a few years by cutting all kinds of transfer payments to the provinces and all kinds of social programs, including ending social housing. So how do we restore it? Well, we had a woman from ACORN there, which is an organization dedicated to organizing people for social change. As unions will tell you, and any other organizations that manage to bring about social change, if you don't stick with it, if you're not organized, you know, you can complain, you can whatever, but we don't have a very strong lobby against the federal and provincial governments for not doing anything in social housing. So remember in 2017, when the National Housing Strategy came out from the Trudeau government, there is no social housing program in there. And in the recent budget, there was a little compromise. There's going to be 6,000 nonprofit co-op housing units being built across the country in the coming few years. But remember, we used to do 20,000 per year, and we stopped doing it. Now, there's more expensive ways of doing it and cheaper ways of doing it. So we should be doing a lot more of that, and we just need more people to insist that that happen. The second question from online. If you had all the legislative financial power, okay, thank you, you needed in Canada, what would you do to solve the housing crisis? Well, that's too big. I think my talk here, I would certainly start with that list I ended with, because in each of those things, it's simply a fair but tough tax as a disincentive, say for speculation or leaving a unit vacant and stuff like that. I would reinstate a social housing supply program, yes. I would have a meaningful housing benefit to help low-income people. And then there are estimated 25, 35,000, perhaps a bit more, unhoused people tonight. That's a small number in a country of, what, 38 million people? So in 3 or 4 or 5 years, we don't have to have what is called mass homelessness. There will always be some people who fall out of stable housing for some reason, okay? Yes, but so that could be ended in 4 or 5 years. The only promise being made by governments is to end what they call chronic homelessness in 10 years. That's a standing promise from the federal and provincial governments, and it's in some of the other provincial platforms too, you'd be surprised, saying the same thing, ending chronic homelessness in 10 years. Well, chronic homelessness is about 20 or 25% of the homeless people, and chronic means that they're unhoused and using homeless services for much of the year. Okay, so yes, we take care of that, but then there's everybody else who's homeless too. So ending chronic homelessness is not ending homelessness. From the room, do we have, this will be our last question, I am told. Who has the last question? Okay.
On one of your slides with the 69-27-4 figure, that was home ownership, yeah, et cetera. You listed some other Western nations, and presumably to show both better and worse examples. And I noticed some of the Western nations there had both a low ownership percentage and a low social housing percentage. Doesn't that imply a high percentage of multiple ownership? And could you help me understand what to infer from that? And presumably, those are some healthier housing systems. Can you help us understand what that means?
Yeah, so part of your question I don't follow, I don't think is quite logical. What I was showing was simply that in owning and renting, and then with non-market rental and owning, similar Western nations, mixed market economies like Canada, have quite different split of those three things. And there is no one right split. I can't say Canada should be 10% this or 70% home ownership is too high. What is too high? And what's wrong with home ownership unless we abuse it in the way that I've been talking about? No, so all I was showing was countries organize those three things: the supply of housing, the mix of housing, and helping people with affordability in different ways, and some way more successfully than others. But it's easier to be successful, like the European countries, if your income gap between rich and poor, your wealth gap, is much smaller. Okay, in the Anglo-American countries, we have the highest income and wealth inequality. So thank you, class. There'll be no homework or no exam, right, Dean Williams? Thank you.